Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. In today's episode of Orchestration for Beginners, we're going to look at the essential rule for orchestration, which is what they teach you if you were to study in France. Like I did, they'll always remember harmony is going to be before everything else. We will look at some excerpts from Charles Koechlin, which I have translated from his master volume, his orchestration manual. And then in part 2, I'm going to show you some examples from my own symphony. Let's begin. J'ai déjà signalé qu'il ne faut pas songer à compléter l'harmonie d'un groupe donné par un ou deux instruments de notre groupe. Le manque d'homogénéité qui se produirait alors serait de nature à vous empêcher de bien saisir la signification des accords. C'est pourquoi les traités posent un principe que si l'on utilise deux ou plusieurs groupes, il faut que l'harmonie de chaque groupe soit complète ou de moins qu'elle se suffise à elle-même. On apprend à exiger en réalité que son harmonie soit absolument complète, mais il ne doit pas être écrit de façon à sonner creux s'il jouait isolément. Un groupe peut n'être représenté que par une partie mélodique, chant principal, contrepoint d'accompagnement, mais en règle générale, un accord est réalisé par des instruments du même groupe. Ainsi, sa recette compréhensible, on saisirait bien qu'il s'agit de l'accord d'ut majeur. Mais la sonorité ne serait ni homogène ni fondue comme les seuls deux. Il n'est pas du tout que si nous voulons mettre en valeur la sorte d'apprêté de telle seconde, cette dissonance aura davantage de caractère produit par deux instruments de même nature. De toute façon, il s'en faut que pour une bonne orchestration, sonant pleine et son disparate, chaque groupe doit offrir l'harmonie complète. All right, now I'd like to break down some of the pivotal scenes that we just saw from the Koechlin. Of course, I'll be translating it into English, and I'd like to start with missing harmony. So my first takeaway from Koechlin is do not split the harmony among two different groups. So what we just saw is a realization from my latest version of my symphony in which I did not make this mistake, but I'd like to show you the harmony. So look on the screen here, we have 3-note chords. Okay, this is piano reduction, and it's first inversion, then the reposition, but the key note to take away is that it is tightly spaced, okay? So when we orchestrate this, it's going to have to be ideally in the same group, which is often not possible with 3, unless you have winds at 3, or at the very least, ideally in the same instrument. But at the very least, it should be in the same group, okay? So notice in this poor realization that I did, that I have it for 2 oboes and viola, okay? First and foremost, before we even talk about the harmony, it is obviously a very, very defective orchestration because of balance reasons, okay? So notice that we have the oboes in their lowish register. Definitely second oboe is in a low register. So it's going to have that honky feeling very present, very noticeable. Okay. Also, the oboes are on fourths. So the listener is going to be hearing these descending fourths. They will be aware of the viola, but it's going to feel completely separate. Also notice that the viola is in a medium register, which is a fine register, but compared to the oboes, they don't blend well. So one of the results of this kind of orchestration is that you're going to have a musical idea that we don't really understand. Now, I want to caution you as well, because some of you who are still in conservatory or thinking of going to the conservatory, I definitely found when I was in conservatory that I had this impulse that was coming from other students as well as faculty maybe, to kind of search these strange, weird effects. Now, on one hand, I guess it's good to experiment, but on the other hand, when it comes to your first orchestral work, I'm sure what you have to say on its own is already highly original, especially since it's coming from you. So be wary of trying to do things in a strange or weird manner just for, just to experiment. You want this to be understood by the listener and rather easily. So if we look now on the screen to my current realization for my symphony, notice that I put it in the woodwinds, so it's in one group, so it's much easier for the listener to kind of associate the sounds together. Also notice that the clarinets and oboes are in registers that are very compatible, like clarinet is especially very flexible in the staff there. Oboe definitely will be more present, which is why I put it on the top voice, which will be the kind of de facto melody when we have just, parallel moving chords and nothing else going on. But the clarinets will provide a sufficient harmonic context. So the next takeaway is what I call the French standard. We know the French love harmony, and they have a whole curriculum of harmony that gets you ready for orchestration, which is why I love the French, why I moved to France. But what I'd summarize is when using two or more groups, the harmony should be complete in each group. Okay, so notice that we have kind of two things going on. So we have the accompaniment, okay, which has a B major chord, okay, and then we have the melody, okay. So notice that the accompaniment in the strings, okay, that's a complete chord, and then the violin ones actually are doing the melody. So the strings have kind of split roles here, and then notice that the woodwinds, they have complete harmony as well. Notice as well that the trumpets with the mute and the registration actually kind of, the ear understands them as a woodwind instrument in this context, or as part of the woodwind group. All right, so Koechlin also explains that the harmony should be self-sufficient if you cannot have the harmony to be complete on its own. So notice that in the strings, we have two roles again, right? We have the accompaniment, which has the B major chord, but then the true melody, which is the C sharp major chord, is placed in the violins. However, notice they're in two different registers so that the ear can easily understand this so-called complex harmony, okay? Then notice that the French horns, as well as the bassoons and clarinets, are on that C sharp major chord. So we do not have complete harmony in the woodwinds in order, or the French horns. We would also need to have that B major chord. So that is why you have to be careful of being too strident and just believing everything that you read, or getting too dogmatic, right? You have to still use your ear. So in this example, the woodwinds and the French horns, they sound good on their own, even if it is not the true ultimate harmony. But in fact, it might sound better this way because we have two different functions. So we have the kind of pedal harmony in the lower strings, and it's juxtaposed against that, that harmony a second away in the other wind instruments. Next tip. So Koechlin talks about placing the melody in just one group. Okay, so how I'd kind of translate this for us, our takeaway, is you can place the melody in one group while adding the full harmony in another group. So in this example, for my symphony from the second movement, Hypnosis, notice in the strings that we have these kind of lush, very simple direct chords in the lower strings, plus the violin 2, and then the melody is placed in the upper voice in the violin 1. So we have a complete summary of what's going on in the music in the strings alone, which is, I find, very common for myself. Then with the brass, likewise, we have the complete chords plus the melody. However, notice that the oboe is the only woodwind instrument, okay? We do not have the fuller harmonic context in the oboes, okay? So this is another effective way to do orchestration because you don't want your orchestration to get too saturated, okay? Another thing you have to be careful of is you want to make sure you have contrast. You don't want to use everyone all the time. Now, another example. Notice here, obviously, the flute has the melody, okay? And notice that it's the only woodwind instrument, okay? So we're kind of bringing a focus on the flute, okay? However, it is doubled down the octave, so giving some support in the violins. And then we have the lower strings provide that harmonic cushion, as well as the French horns have that warm harmonic cushion. So notice, in addition, we have a slightly different role for each group. We have the flute has the melody, we have the horns giving this nice middle texture, and then we have the strings providing the full harmonic picture. All right, so the next tip that I want to take away from the Charles Koechlin is what I refer to as simple, effective orchestration. Please do not think that complexity is the way forward. Simplicity is almost always the way forward, but can't be too simplistic. Okay? So notice this triad here. Okay? Now, Koechlin does say in other parts of the volume, and even in this section, which I haven't cited, that contrapuntal listening is different. So if you have an orchestra piece, and there's like, it's a fugue or there's something truly, truly contrapuntal, then the way that we listen and understand is often different. So like wide gaps and stuff may not be a problem if we can understand it through linear motion. But in this example, just as a whole note, okay, we have a low trumpet and then a high trumpet, so they're not balanced. Okay, they're two different registers, all right? And the upper trumpet is really going to dominate the texture because you have to imagine that it's going to probably be written a second higher, or, and then we have the cellos in the middle. The cellos, though they're in a warm register, that's probably going to be like a tenor clef, they're going to probably sound thin and wispy compared to these two trumpets kind of sandwiching them. So this is probably not going to be a very good orchestration unless it's like you get there through an eighth note as part of like really good counterpoint. Okay, so aside from that, it's not good orchestration. Now what he shows is look at these three trumpets in a similar tessitura. Okay, so they're going to blend much better. It's the same instrument, so the ear has no problem just picking up. Now, he does mention that in the former example, we will still comprehend the overall harmony, but it just has a strange and kind of weird and probably not very effective orchestration. Now, he also shows, cellos, French would say divisé à quatre, okay, so you divided them into four parts. Okay, that's going to be very homogeneous. We're going to understand it. Now, of course, a danger with that, when you ever do divisé strings, you got to listen, is that thinning out the sound. Because if you have only 8 cellos to begin with, and then you have 4 different parts, that's 2 per part. So is it going to sound like chamber music? Is it going to be well balanced compared to what else is going on? Okay? Now, one thing I do want to mention, which I think I've talked about a little bit already, is what I call forced originality. So in this left-hand example, yeah, it's kind of interesting, okay, but is that what you really want? Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of composers when they're in school, especially in school, it seems to change when they get out of school, but they're trying to be original, trying to do something edgy, weird, strange, and the most you'll get is maybe a little bit of like ego from that. But at the end of the day, you have an orchestra piece to do, okay, it's a lot of work, and just focus on hearing your vision and just using the means you have to make it sound good. All right, so dissonance. My main takeaway from Charles Koechlin here is dissonance is easiest to understand when placed in the same instrument. So Charles Koechlin shows this G, which is the consonant harmony, against an F sharp, which goes down to E. So the F sharp would be the dissonance, all right? And then he goes on to show if he were to orchestrate that with xylophone and flute. Now, it's not going to be something atroce, in French. It's not going to be something offensive to the ear or anything like that, but you've kind of lost the potency of your dissonance, right? Even going back to Bach, the St. Matthew Passion, the dissonant oboes and the dissonant violins and stuff like that. The dissonance sounds a lot better, and it French would say ça frappe. Okay, it hits your ears, and we understand it as a dissonance when you place it in the same instrument. Okay, now maybe it's not always going to be possible to do it that way, but if you want that dissonance to kind of hit you in the face, then you do well to put it in the same instrument. And then finally, the last takeaway I would say is that complete harmony in every group. You will not always have complete harmony in every group, but it is kind of a good kind of place to be. So those of you who are applying to our first ever competition, Competition and its allies, make sure you get your work done within the deadline. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.